Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us on a Thursday afternoon or morning for some of you all. I think the topics that we're going to really try to cover today around the current environment of innovation due to COVID, client stories of how brands and companies have really successfully pivoted during this time, tactics, we're going to get practical, techniques to get close to your customer to know what they need, maybe some funding questions, and leading your teams through this time of crisis. So I want to ask our panelists to unmute themselves. And I'm going to ask each of them a specific question where they can share a little bit of background and their unique perspective. And then we're going to just open it up. We incorporated some questions that you guys all had, and we're looking forward to it. Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Natalie, I'll start with the ladies in the house. At Peer Insight, you work with companies and develop their innovation capabilities, and you often have to help them specifically launch an idea to market. What's been your experience during this time with clients and their innovation initiatives as a result of COVID? Like, are you seeing it now as like the most urgent necessity to grow, or are just people pushing pause and trying to survive? What have you seen?
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit of both. I kind of almost right down the middle. What I love about the title of this panel is exactly what half of this group, but maybe more like 30% of the group is doing, which is they are having to innovate like they've never had to before. I think innovation, it's just a means to growth. It's developing new things to continue the growth of your firm. So it competes, usually in a normal world, it competes constantly with the core business. And so it's hard to get the light of day sometimes, and attention and resources, that sort of thing. Now, if the core business is essentially gone or completely disrupted, then you got no other choice it's not really growth, it's survival. And that could be a really powerful motivator, right? And so it's getting its seat at the table in some places too, but it requires a massive leadership push to get it there. So you see companies like, I've been really inspired by Panera. They started doing pretty quickly into this. Obviously, people are still coming to get meals to go, and they constantly had a conversation with their customers, which has also been a big push this under COVID, is to say you have to stay in touch with your customers. It's not a nice to have anymore. It's like you have to be in dialogue constantly, or the people who are innovating are. And customers like, look, if I'm already there, I know you have eggs back there somewhere. Can you just get a whole bunch of them, and I can get my groceries there too? Can I just get some essentials? Can you just get that, and I can buy from you? And they launched this thing, I think, in about 3 months, or 3 weeks. And they're like, that would have taken, and they said in the article, this is in the Wall Street Journal, that this would have taken them max a year or minimum a year to do. That just to do something that seems simple, right? And I think this has been a huge push to get people to do things that are new and do them really fast. And you're starting to see some hotel chains like Hilton and others that I'm talking with saying, okay, no one wants to come to our hotels, and also no one wants to go to their offices. Can we start renting out hotel rooms and rig them up to be basically many offices that you can, they're safe and you can kind of come work for the day if you have to, recognizing that the future of work will be completely different. Those are two things that, and she said that would have taken at least 2 years to just have discussions about that. So this has been a huge shift. Now you have another whole half of the crew, and I mean, we experienced it, right? They're certainly not going to spend money on consultants at this point that have paused everything, right? And it's about the core business and keeping the lights on, and it's survival mode in that way. But you start, my guess is that you'll start to see those are the same folks who shut the brakes in 2008, right? Sony, GM, these are same places that are kind of suffering now, and GSA, and Motorola, places that used to were huge, and you've not really heard as much of them yet. So this thing, you see a lot of people both pausing, and then you see people who are kind of in the middle who are, I think, some of the folks that we're working with, like all of us, right? It's hard to kind of stay focused at one particular point in time. So they're kind of going through the motions, but it's with less focus, less speed, less intentionality, I'd say. But it's sort of like, well, I think we're supposed to keep moving in this. And so that's why I really feel like there's kind of two, one camp who's just doing it. And those, obviously those will be the people to watch from here on out. You also see growth in terms of partnerships and open innovation finally working. I think open innovation can sound nice, but usually when you pair two big companies together, they're just slow. And so you start to see places, obviously making PPE, like GM and Ford partnering on that type of thing together. So that's been, and clearly education firms and stuff like that too. And then there's still a lot of venture. I'm sure Scott will get into this, but Facebook launched a venture fund, Intel's doing M&A. I mean, there's still big sectors of the economy that are moving forward on this and probably taking advantage of their of the fact that they're still very pervasive in this particular economy. So that's a little bit what we're seeing.
Yeah, that's a really good kind of spectrum. Dave, Natalie kind of talked about this, but many are saying, COVID simply accelerated, changes that we knew were coming. And you wrote a book and you take clients at TopRight through like a 3S playbook model that's about like right story, right strategy, and right systems. Would you talk to us a little bit what you found helpful in guiding clients navigate through a crisis like this?
Yeah, happy to. I think what's interesting about the topic today, crisis is the mother of innovation, is that a lot of us forget that great innovation happens in a lot of different ways, but there's something powerful about uniting around a purpose. And a lot of times a crisis shines a light on our purpose. And I'll give you some examples today of brands that I think are performing well and coming through the crisis in a great innovative way because they just have a great sense of purpose. And one of the things that we see often is that brands that are, let's just say, less than authentic or maybe don't have a particularly good story to tell, they're the ones that are suffering, right? And they're the ones that are having, as Natalie pointed out, they're having to batten down the hatches and focus on the core because they really don't have the fuel in the tank, if you will, to innovate, nor are consumers and customers willing to give them permission to innovate. They just want their hamburger, or they just want they just want safe and clean services. And they're not going to pay attention to, let's say, marketing talk about innovation if they don't believe your story. And so I thought today I'd share just one example from one of our clients that I think has really a powerful story. What I mean by that is they've got a very specific purpose. It's a simple and clear and compelling message. In this case, it's "Eat more chicken" is essentially their tagline. But beyond that, Chick-fil-A is probably one of the most authentic brands in the markets where they compete, not because they've done something innovative from a food perspective, even though Truett Cathy would probably argue with me, and Dan Cathy would say that they invented the chicken sandwich, right? But that's not why they get credit for innovation. They get credit for innovation because they've built very, very strong ties in every community where they work and where they live and where they deliver chicken sandwiches. So much to the point that consumers describe Chick-fil-A not as a behemoth kind of McDonald's or Burger King or Wendy's. They talk about it in terms of my Chick-fil-A. And I think when you see a brand like that in crisis mode, which they have been, just like Panera, as Natalie said, and just like McDonald's and every other quick serve restaurant that's out there, what makes them different is the fact that they have an authentic story and a purpose that consumers already believed in. So now when they add capabilities, for example, when they're bringing mobile devices to the curbside and letting you to order right from the door of your car, or doing delivery services through DoorDash, or coming up with unique ways to cater events, it's believable, right? It's a story that we believe in. It's not like they just bolted it on. And in fact, many of the technologies that you'll see Chick-fil-A competing with today are things that they've been innovating on and working on for literally the last decade. And maybe we're not being used as much, but now they're being used every day. They're also doing some amazing things, for example, and they recognize that catering and delivery are going to be incredibly important. And so one of their key innovations was, let's build stores that are purpose-built with larger kitchens just for catering and just for delivery service operations, with a tiny little walk-up window where if someone happens to come to the store, we'll serve them a chicken sandwich through the window. So today they've got two very innovative store formats in Nashville and Louisville, where they've already kind of addressed a lot of the gaps and concerns that consumers had about how would they be able to get the product, the Chick-fil-A product set, without having to have a drive-through or an in-store experience. And so again, I think one of the biggest lessons we've learned here is that even in a mode of crisis, if you have a bad story, it's going to lead to a place that's very destructive to the business. Consumers are not going to trust you. And when you have a powerful story, a compelling story going into crisis, not only will consumers reward you, but they'll also let you innovate and give you permission to try new things, recognizing that it's part of your overall purpose. It's not something that you've just manufactured because we're in crisis.
Now, I love your example, Dave, because everything stacks on top of brand, and even their process is about bringing humans into the drive-through, right? It's right on brand.
Yeah.
Awesome. Great example. Scott, you are leading Deep Labs, and for many companies, raising capital during this time might be the only way to survive, grow, or innovate right now. As head of that, you recently closed a round of funding during the pandemic. Impressive. What was your experience like, and what are the lessons that you learned that you could share during this time? And did you see anything different that was especially important to investors during a time like this?
Well, I guess maybe I'd first start with saying it definitely was an experience.
Uh-huh.
And I think also very important to sort of maybe level set in terms of what was happening pre-pandemic, right? So from a pre-pandemic perspective, and again, maybe takes with a certain grain of salt because I'm out in San Francisco, Silicon Valley, et cetera, but it really was about sort of the vanity metrics. It's like, how many staff do you have? What's your burn rate? How many rounds have you already raised? How much have you raised, et cetera, as opposed to necessarily focusing in on sort of the tried and true value metrics, so to speak. And so it was grow at all cost, burn through as much cash you possibly can, acquire as many customers. It doesn't matter what the LTV or long-term value of the customer is. Just in some cases, buy the market.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Then the pandemic hits. Suddenly, what's old is new. Everyone wants to know about profitability. They want to know the margin analysis. They want to understand the revenue walk. They want to understand exactly, does your solution or does your product offering, does it have legs? Is it a cyclical product versus a structural product? Meaning, if the pandemic introduces this brand new world, how will you fare? Oh, and by the way, I have these other portfolio companies that didn't plan for a rainy day. And so now I'm having to shore up those companies. So actually, I know I've been talking to you for a month to invest, but we have to hold off. Maybe we can talk in June or July. And the answer obviously is no, we have to get moving, right? So, from a personal experience, it was definitely a learning experience. But what I'd say is that as we were going through the process, just being very open and transparent with you guys, we had agreed upon deal terms the last week of February. We're scheduled to close, let's call it the last week of March, roughly 4 weeks later. And during this backdrop, that's when massive layoffs, pandemic really hits the U.S. The newscasters are talking about the next Great Depression, et cetera, et cetera. So you might imagine that certain investors got a little squeamish. And so in many cases, it was understanding how to tell your narrative in a compelling way. It was very much telling a narrative that maps to the very clear paradigm shift that was happening. And in our industry, we happen to play in payments and financial services. It was very clearly the notion of, hey, some of these trends were already happening anyway, but now they're being accelerated. So the digitization of currency, as an example, going from cash to plastic cards or even mobile payments. It was the card not present environment transaction. So everyone not necessarily going into a store and swiping a card, but let's be honest, I'm getting older and lazier, so I sit on my couch and order things off Amazon all the time, right? So these are sort of trends that we knew were coming, but were vastly accelerated, right? Mm-hmm. And so we were, in some cases, somewhat fortunate in the sense that we saw some of these trends just in general, but we were able to, again, tell a compelling narrative that allowed us to say, look, yeah, we know very bad things are happening outside. Absolutely. That said, we are very well positioned because of what our solution does. Again, we're able to tell a story that says, look, at the end of the day, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when from a revenue perspective. So yeah, certain revenue might be delayed by a month or two, whatever else, but at the end of the day, we will be profitable. We understand exactly where our customers are. We have a compelling narrative. And ultimately, we have gained the trust of our current anchor customers because, we've been obsessive about execution. And, into some of the other speakers' points earlier, that provides you the not only just a support mechanism and certainly revenue, but also it gives you the right to play. And that right to play is very, very powerful, especially as you go to, as you try to acquire additional customers in a time like this. You can very easily, frankly, use them as reference customers. And that's, very, very helpful. And I would say, just sort of to round up my comments, again, what's old is new. And so if you're out there trying to raise right now, they don't care about vanity metrics. Trust me, they really don't. What they care about is tell me exactly your path to profitability. Take me on a revenue walk and help me truly understand exactly what the path is to acquiring lasting customers, not just customers that you'll have for the next 3 months during the next lockdown in California, let's say.
Yeah. Just like what a wide range. One thing I wanted to ask you, I asked all of you kind of a little bit of this and you all touched on it, but there's, two extremes of fear during this opportunity, batten down the hatches, like you said, Dave, not now, it's not the time to innovate. We just got to get through this and survive. And then there's the other side, which, more short-term, and then now long-term is there's opportunity, right? Those brands that see that we have to innovate in order to grow and survive. What do you guys say to each reaction? And, maybe you have an example of some that are just head down and just kind of get through this. Anything to add that you guys would share on that question?
I'll jump in because I have a real live case that I'm working on right now with a company. It's a company called Grubber. It's not a company anybody would have heard of, but they're probably going to end up being one of the biggest beneficiaries of this crisis. And I'll explain that in just a second. But they're operating the business from a place of opportunity. And I think one of the keys to success in crisis is you have to look at the system that you have differently. So if you look at your system like this is the way we've always made money, kind of to Scott's point, and you're going to batten down the hatches just to continue making money the same way. This client of mine is basically in the business of making kiosks, right? They make those touchscreen kiosks when you go into retail. And it's a very competitive, it's a hardware-centric business. It's very dog eat dog. So if they'd gone into the crisis with this fear mode, right, it would have been slash prices, try to lock down the customers we have, batten down the hatches. But they looked at the system differently and they said, look, in a crisis mode where we're all wearing masks and we really don't want to touch anything and we have issues with even like using cash. I don't know if anybody's had to go to a restaurant lately and try to pay with cash. They'll be like, the first thing they don't want to see is your dirty dollar, right, in their hand. So what Grubber has done is they said, well, let's turn this around. Let's look at the system differently. We're not a kiosk company. We are a contactless commercial relationship builder, okay? And so in addition to having a kiosk where you can walk up with a phone, scan a QR code, and then order on your own device, they've also woven in a cashless, a way to actually accept cash using cash recyclers so that nobody has to touch your money. On the back end, they've got a POS payment system that allows you to use credit cards as well. And then in terms of self-service on the delivery end of the business, they've got a hot box technology that you walk up to and you type in, again, using your phone, your code, and you pull out your pizza or your chicken sandwich or your hamburger. And so they've really completely innovated their system. Again, the core technology was kiosk and point of service. But at the end of the day, by re-envisioning the system and thinking like a customer as opposed to a supplier, they've been able to really crack the code on something that's now going to be a source of innovation and revenue for them for decades to come.
Great example. Okay, I will ask you guys, this was a big theme in the questions from our alumni. Where do you see changes that will stick post-COVID and others that might be more temporary? Like, which are the quick hits and which do you see are making lasting transformations? Like, again, maybe mobile payments and cashless might be one example, obviously. So, Scott, do you want to just kind of speak to that of what you're seeing and your timing?
Sure. I think easy quick hitter would be card not present payments or mobile payments, right? So, certainly the notion of, let's be honest, even eating out to Dave's earlier point, even eating out is technically a mobile payment in many in many neighborhoods now. So people aren't using cards; they're using their mobile device, right? And ultimately, this that sort of scenario starts training people to think that, oh, well, I don't need to bring cash anywhere I go now, whether it be online or even in sort of the real world, so to speak. And I would say that an acceleration of some of these trends, even my parents, as an example, now actually use, it's actually funny to say, my dad actually uses, the iOS device actually to make payments, which I would have placed a, literally $1 million bet. My dad would never do that. He's 75 years old. It would not happen, right? But what I'd also say is that it is training generations of people that normally would not have, let's say, taken advantage of these new trends. And what I always sort of talk to some of my corporate clients when I was back at Booz Allen is look at the fundamental enablers that are enabling things like mobile payments or contactless or touchless payments and everything else. And it really comes down to everything ranging from sensor technology or gyroscopes, accelerometers, all the way to things like biometrics. And so those are sort of like, when I speak to potential investors or anything else, I start talking about those enablers because those are enabling technologies that are ripe to trigger innovation in areas that maybe would have been stagnant for another decade or two because they didn't have to move.
Right. Yeah, everything's been accelerated. Natalie, anything that you're seeing like as trends that, to pay attention to?
Yeah, I think this kind of goes to this question and the one that Dave answered earlier. I mean, I think it sounds, I think going to Scott's back to the basics, right? If leadership is not ready to admit that they already, even beforehand, innovation takes some amount of lack of ego and some humility of what else could be, what else is out there. Everything we do today, we don't know everything. That can be really hard to juggle with the sense of expertise that comes for running a massive core business well with that precision that you need, right? That people are demanding too. If that wasn't already there, you better hope it's in there now, right? If you at all think you know anything right now, then that's a tough spot to be. But I think there is a little bit of digging in heels, right? To some extent of just, we're just going to pause. We're going to kind of ignore it. Maybe it'll go away. But this sense of, and this should start to rebuild sort of the entrepreneurial muscles that a lot of big companies lost a long time ago after they were a startup in some way. Everybody was, but going back to your roots of like, what else could there be? What else could we be doing? And I think sometimes there's also a pressure for the boardroom to know that in the boardroom, right? To read a bunch of white papers and figure it out. And what we're seeing more than ever is start doing what a lot of entrepreneurs have to do, which is go and talk to people about what's their world like now. Because if you thought you knew your customer, you don't anymore. Their world has changed. And so having that open dialogue with them and then build something that they need. I mean, plain and simple. And I think some of it is if you don't have strong leadership going into this, that'll be a challenge. And if you don't have strong values, I think Dave hinted at this earlier. Who are you as a company, right? Why do you exist? And does everybody wake up and feel that way? Startups are good at kind of rallying around, this is what we're trying to do for our customer, right? Big organizations often lose that. There's lots of rallying cries, in different pockets. So to come back to how can we make somebody's lives better, right? And get back to that hunger to acquire a customer in a new way, too, I think, and do it authentically. Because like you said, I mean, you can't do sales right now with a trace of inauthenticity, right? And without a foundation of a relationship or like, I'm deeply trying to help you. And so I think it'll just be more of an interesting of who survives from that. But I think if you didn't have that in place now, it's really up the battle to build it. And so it'll be interesting to see just from those kind of underpinning factors, how that plays out.
Great. At least a great question, but I want to make sure, Dave, did you want to add anything to trends that we're seeing, things that will like absolutely stick? They are the now new normal.
Yeah, I think, and again, this is kind of self-serving because it's what the business that we're in, right? But I think people are, the innovations that are going to stick are not the things that you think of first. So for example, when GM and Dyson started making ventilators, right? Everybody was screaming, oh, how innovative, how innovative. Well, and Natalie kind of hinted at this earlier too, there are lots of things that we can make. And there are lots of things that potentially would be new to the world or new opportunities. But I'm not going to go out and buy a GM ventilator. I mean, the GM brand, what GM stands for, does not fit with that product. It was out of necessity. It was an innovation out of necessity, which will not stick over time. The things that stick and the things that tend to bring consumers and customers, get them right here in the heart, tend to be things that are experience-based, right? It's not the new tech, it's how the new tech is used, right? Jen, even when I brought up the Chick-fil-A example, you didn't talk about the fact that they're using an iPad. You talked about the fact that they're bringing people to the curbside. That's the experience that Chick-fil-A is trying to drive home. It's not the fact that they've got a really cool app, which they do, by the way. But it's the fact that it's actually in concert with the people, the processes, and ultimately the technology platforms that deliver the end-to-end experience. Those things will stick because people, quite frankly, they love that and they talk about it. They tell their friends, and those are innovations that really make a difference in people's lives.
Perfect. I think all of us in the world of work, whether we are working with customers or our bosses, we're in a place where we can see things. What have you guys seen as like lessons in fostering innovation, either, with clients or within your companies? How do you successfully get clients and customers to adopt more innovative practices, more kind of just change that culture during this time when a lot of people might see it like as a necessity? Do you guys have any tips or tactics to help kind of all of us in the audience?
Happy to jump in. I think the biggest key is just understanding that you have to meet them where they're at. All right. So it's a large portion of all of this transformation, certainly in terms of large companies, it's a classic change management. Right. So understanding where they are, having them do a bit of self-reflection, having a baseline of, again, understanding where they are and then where they want to be, understanding the outcomes, measure the outcomes. Again, so some of this is classic consulting 101, understanding the KPIs, and then understanding where they are, have them understand and help them jointly create the vision. And then from a tactical standpoint, and I can't stress this enough, really create prosumers within the organization as opposed to just consumers, right? So it's very easy to say, oh, we're going to do an innovation program. It's going to be great. Everyone's voice is going to be heard. Rah, rah. That's great. That's fine. That's important. Energy is important. That said, everyone should want to give in order to get. And you need to have programs in place that not only encourage that, reward that, but measure that.
Mm-hmm.
Love it.
A lot of what our clients are doing right now is just taking small bites, like moving forward in small cycles. And I think the challenge is keeping the cycle going. It's like, what can we learn in 30 days, right, about our customers, and how can we think differently from that? And then track that sort of from too, like, what did we think we knew going in and what did we learn from what people said to us? But I think honestly, just working in a tighter, faster cycles is helpful for both an energy and an ability to execute. And just, it seems so daunting, and you don't know. It's hard to say, let's start in a 3-month innovation project. Well, you don't know. So let's not do that. Let's do it in 30, which is, is not always the delivery model that consultants want necessarily, ourselves included, but it's where people have to be right now. And it's what helps them put a toe in the water and get moving.
No, and I love that because both of you guys are speaking, as consultants and folks that have customers, but you can also use it within your teams, with your boss, to try to, bring that. Dave, anything to add there that you're seeing?
I wouldn't underestimate the power of being innovative in your communications. Because I'll give you a good example. I mean, you all probably remember, within the first 30 days of this pandemic really hitting the wires and everybody getting nervous. I mean, how many emails or how many pieces of paper did you get that always started off in these unprecedented times, right?
Amen.
Or something along those lines, right? And Jen, I know you've done work with a company here in Atlanta called Delta, and Ed Bastian, who is, I think, probably one of my best examples of how to do it right.
Yes.
You've got to be, not only do you have to be authentic and honest and open with your audience, and that whether that's inside the company or outside the company, doesn't matter. Ideally, it's the same message, right? You're not making up messages for inside that are different from outside the company. That's a whole different we could have a whole different call just about that. But, you know, if you're really innovative in thinking about how do you do one of the things Scott said, which is meet people where they are, meet them sort of where their mental state is, and communicate in a really authentic, relevant, and timely way. Don't just dump everything on them and tell them, here's all the things we're doing. Bastian has done a fabulous job at Delta really building, I would call it just those little baby steps that Natalie was talking about, just telling people what we know, when we know it, and when we're darn certain about it, not fabricating things or making things up or hoping that something's going to change. Be very specific, be very narrowcast, and be very genuine and honest that you're trying to tackle these problems. You may not have figured it all out yet, but you're on the path to coming up with a better solution. And again, I look forward to getting my messages from Delta, mainly because I want to ultimately get back on airplanes someday, but because I think they're really well-crafted communications that are just simple, clear, and you can tell that everybody at Delta is fully aligned behind it.
Yeah, and it's not one and done, right? It's like almost like it's an update. Like I think it's called, you know, the update from Ed. Yeah, great example. Okay, so this is like the elephant in the room. We're all remote, right? How, and you know, spread out as a team, how has this affected the success rate or the ability of teams to build or test innovations? How do you, you know, like remote sprints, virtual sessions, how do you, you know, continue that culture of innovation when teams are spread out?
This has been really hard for us. We were already really digital, but I mean, I'm not sure if this is innovation. I think part of it is people are already having to work differently, right? You got all your stuff going on in your house and all the virtual stuff. But I think, you know, most companies, like you were doing some virtual stuff, you're distributed in some way. But then to ask somebody to work differently on top of it, you know, to activate different parts of their brain and to move, you know, a lot of times innovation, a lot of it is about speed, not for sometimes getting the market fast, but also to keep momentum going and to keep you at the pulse of the data coming in that you need to read and pivot with too. So we're finding it very difficult to keep people engaged. They're not focused, which I think innovation takes some pretty good, like I'm watching and I'm listening, right? It's an iterative feedback loop. So you got to be on the game. You can't like set it aside and let the consultants do it and come back too. So I think we're finding a lot of trouble with that. And then they're shifting goalposts. You know, a lot of times in innovation, you may not know what you're building, but you have a goalpost at the end that you're like, I don't care how you get there, but do it. That's shifting around, which has been difficult. And I think people's just energy to move fast, or their ability, I mean, you know, and that gets into all kinds of other parts of the people's lives that are tugging at them too. But we're really finding that probably, you know, now we're moving into month 4. It's like, this isn't, I feel like there's a shift right now of like, we're now in a marathon, what we thought might be a sprint. And we're really trying to figure out how to help clients work more effectively, right? It used to just be about the content of what are we producing. And now it's like, well, because we typically don't work in that classic, we'll take it, we'll make you a deck. No, this is a constant iterative partnership. And that has been really challenging. And that's probably more of a macro question, but I think in particular, since innovation holds a lot of ambiguity and a time that already has a lot of ambiguity, it's too much. It's becoming too much. So yeah, we're seeing that.
Yeah, I think I'll maybe piggyback on those comments. I would say that in some ways we've had to double down on focus. And it sounds sort of basic, but focus. And I would say also doubling down on recognizing even the small wins, right? To keep people motivated and hungry. And I would say we're somewhat fortuitous in the sense that we can literally see after our next sprint, when we roll out a new release, that we had some sort of, you know, delta in terms of, let's say, fraud detection. That's what we're let's say. So it's very easy for us to say, look what you guys did. I know you guys are all, you know, fatigued and everything's crazy. Look what you guys did. This is awesome. And, you know, and it sounds a little cheesy and corny, but even to grown adults, it's like, I did that. And so that focus, that reward system really helps, at least within our group, help sort of normalize the situation a bit.
Mm-hmm.
I'll tell you one of the unexpected surprises of kind of transitioning to this digital experience is if you've got a certain amount of empathy, right? you learn a lot more about people than you knew before. I mean, I've met more of my clients, you know, pets, dogs, cats. I've met children that I've heard about, but never met them in person. I've seen, you know, interesting styles of pajamas. You know, there's a glass half full kind of analogy here too, which is it's making different kinds of human connections. It may not be the most efficient or productive way all the time, but there is a silver lining here, I think, which is maybe helping us connect in some different ways that we did not do before.
Yeah, no, and obviously empathy is huge to understanding our customer needs, which I think you teed this up beautifully, Dave, and probably not on purpose. But let's get tactical for a second. So, you know, we always talk about like massive innovation with AI and data and all these things. But to Natalie's point, I think you touched on this, is getting really close to the customer. And no matter where you are in an organization, what industry you're in, we all need to understand our customers and our consumers, prosumers. What are the tactics and the techniques that you guys are seeing that's really effective to get feedback from customers? Again, you know, remote, distance, like it's an obstacle. What, you know, face-to-face, socially distanced focus groups? Do you do Zoom, like surveys? Like, what are you guys seeing is helping you to understand customers?
I can take a stab at it. You know, a lot of our work is helping people figure out what to build, not how to build it and add features. So for us, that ethnographic work is huge, right?
Yeah.
And we're never going and asking them about the product. We're asking them what's going on in their world.
Right.
So we're using actually right now, we've always kind of used virtual interviews pretty well, especially to reach and distributed teams. But diary studies, and they need a better name because it makes you think like you're breaking out your Lisa Frank, you know, little like 12-year-old diary. But it's almost like a platform where you're almost interacting like you would a social media or texting, but you're giving feedback along the way. Yeah. Maybe to a prototype, maybe to just your world and how you're navigating it. But that has been immensely helpful to us to understand someone, especially over time, right? Because you're getting people at different parts of their world too. We might only run it for 7 days, but that gives us data that it makes me wish we had probably used it earlier, right, beforehand. But this forced this tool to be used a lot more, and it's been incredibly effective at helping us really not just understand what's going on with people's world, but why and what they're feeling about it.
Yeah, I've seen it just like, what do you think is going to happen in 30 days? What do you think is going to happen in a year? You know, those kind of questions. I agree, Natalie. Scott or Dave?
We're still, I think, this will probably go down in history of kind of one of the hardest questions to ever really answer. Like what are reliable ways to really get inside the mind of the customer or the consumer or the prosumer? And I think the one thing that we've got going for us right now, and my firm is doing a lot of research with different forms of AI, using predictive analytics. I mean, the thing we got going for us, we have a lot of data, right? Now, that's different from like when I first got into this industry. We relied heavily on, as Natalie was saying, a lot of observational work, focus groups, more qualitative types of things, which I think always give you kind of only part of the story. And we always used to take that and then merge it with quantitative and try to figure out, try to draw some insight. Well, the curse, I guess, the reason why it's a hard question is data is becoming like a part of every one of our days. I mean, we are leaving trails of data behind us in what we do. The challenge is really, it still is not, when you think about AI, it still is not a very useful predictor of all things, right? So I can gather certain data about what you're looking at online, what you bought at Amazon, even what you ordered online last night for dinner. I've still got this supposition that, okay, because you bought, this kind of hamburger and you went online and bought a case of wine from this winery, it's still very, very hard to then predict what's next, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's really where a lot of our work is going, which is how can we begin to understand intent, not just past action and what people wanted, yesterday, and how that is shaping their decisions today, but more, what is it that in a series of decisions over a lengthy period of time, can you really get predictive about how to better serve your customers? And again, I think the jury's out, at least it is from my perspective. I mean, there's a lot of tools out there that people promise these things, but we've done a lot of research on them, and it's AI is sort of missing some of the I right now, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
So I have to jump in now. Some of this will be self-serving comments given my work, but so I guess what I first start out is by saying there's a fundamental difference between identity versus a persona, right? And so how I sort of frame this would be an identity, Scott Eddington, right? He happens to be sitting in Oakland, California right now. And you can, verify my driver's license. That's really Scott. Fine. That said, the Scott Eddington sitting here, I guess July 9th, is dramatically different than the Scott Eddington sitting here, let's say February 5-6 months ago because of the pandemic, right? So all my desires, my influences have shifted based on space, based on time, based on weather, based on pandemic, right? And so the ability to decipher between the different personas that I might exhibit as I go throughout my day is something that has been a breakthrough scientifically in the last, let's call it year and a half. And so the ability to really break down individuals at the persona level, basically a multidimensional view of a human being, which then allows you to do some of the predictive analytics that you're talking about, is becoming more and more normal. And in fact, because there's such a treasure trove of data that actually has very rich and useful signals where seemingly there was just noise even 18 months ago.
Right.
That's where AI really does come into play, right? So the ability to really get down to hyper-personalized understanding of an individual at this moment in time, and I guess 11:50 West Coast time versus the same individual 2 hours later, my persona will have shifted based on space, based on time. And so my point sort of with that self-serving message is only to say that that's where the technology is certainly headed. And so whether you're using that for marketing purposes, whether you're using that to better understand in terms of product placement, whether it be using that to understand what features you should roll out for your next software release, these are all things that are, frankly, they're here.
Yeah, no, and I love that you point that out. It goes from, being very manual with like asking individuals to, like you said, Scott, is kind of getting an aggregate view that can bring that that hyper-personal approach. I had one more question about leadership, but it's 10 till. So I wanted to just ask Eric to chime in. I know he's been looking at the chat to see if there are any Q&A. If there are not too many, then I can go ahead and ask. But Eric, what are your thoughts on if we should open it up to Q&A?
Yeah, I think that'd be great. I've got a few that have come in, and see here. So one of the things is mentioning on the pivots of companies. Some companies are able to do so, local here, say in Charlottesville, you get the message from the coffee shop. Now they're delivering to the doorstep. And I remember somebody being on a call, they said, "How are you doing?" And they said, "Good, I got my delivery this morning." So they've kind of shifted where there's certain industries to where it's kind of at a standstill until there may be a vaccine or some kind of solution in that manner, specifically when it comes to kind of travel, international aspects. So just kind of the question is kind of what advice, what have you seen for companies that are in that industry to where it's kind of hit a dead end that needs to be opened up? United in August, they just said that they're going to do 40% of their scheduled flights. So there's a change there, but yet that also relies on people, how comfortable they are to travel. So for someone in that industry, kind of what would be some advice and what have you seen?
I mean, I'll add one thing, sometimes there's not innovation that can happen, that's seen externally. Sometimes innovation happens internally, within your processes, with employees, and your experience. Even just looking at how Airbnb, it was seen as like this case study of how to take care of your employees, innovative communications, like Dave said. So I think sometimes looking internally can be where you can, foster innovation and think differently so that you are ready when things change.
And I
Anything
do think
you guys would add? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I do think there's a time element here, Eric. The answer to that question is actually really kind of tricky because there are lots of little things. In your example, the coffee shop, or the example that Natalie gave earlier about, what else can we buy when we go to the Panera or the local coffee shop? Can they sell me toilet paper, right? There are things like that that are short-term, I would say very good pivots that keep you in business, right? And they also keep you connected with your consumers. There are going to be some long-term impact types of things. And since you mentioned the airline industry, which I know just a little bit about, it's going to be maybe 5 years. I've heard anywhere from 3 to 5 years before you'll see that industry get back to what we might refer to as normal, okay? And I'm not just talking about revenue or volume of traffic, but just trust, right? Like people feeling comfortable, right? And that's a big deal in an industry like airline, airline with a safety mandate. So again, I think pivots are, generally people think it's quick fix, like turn things around quickly, make some revenue, make the customer happy. I think some of these companies are going to have to be looking at this in a much longer term perspective and finding ways maybe in the short term, like Delta right now, for example, they're still sending a lot of flights with almost no people on them, but there's a lot of cargo on the flight, right? So their short-term pivot is we have to fly, in some cases because the government tells them they have to go to certain locations. But instead of having passengers, they're just putting more cargo on the planes. So there are things like that you may see that for the next year, with airlines in particular.
Yeah, and if I could sort of add on to that and talk about airlines. So one of our bigger customers is a global payment network, and that global payment network derives an awful lot of its revenue from what they call cross-border transactions, which, like it sounds like people coming in from other countries and such, right? And well, obviously, if people aren't traveling, then cross-border transactions are going to be down, right? And so what they've done, even in a short amount of time since the pandemic started, is focused and doubled down on domestic related transactions, and specifically for, frankly, a under-targeted market historically, which is the underbanked, or people who traditionally wouldn't have a banking account, as an example. So the issuing of prepaid cards to enable people either to get disbursements from the government, or again, for unemployment benefits, et cetera, et cetera. So it doesn't always have to be sort of a revolutionary, innovative thing. It can literally just be something as simple as reallocation of resources to focus in on something that maybe would have been in second or third place during, let's say a normal time period.
Great. Got one that's come through, pointed to you, Dave, but I also think it's something everyone can add on to. It said, you provided an example of a good story, a good pivot. Can you give an example of a bad story?
Oh my gosh. Come back to me. I'm an eternal optimist, guys. I have a hard time telling, even if it's somebody that I know well, I'd have a hard time throwing people under the bus. So come back to me on that one.
Correct.
Scott or Natalie?
Yeah, it's hard to talk openly about it, but I mean, just a general thought of, like I said, we see a swath of our clients, and we've got some that are sticking their head in the sand of that project's been delayed, and it's been delayed, and you're like, okay, somebody else is going to grab that, and they're going to do it, and it's just a matter of how fast, how much money do you have, how much are you sitting on? And I think, to be honestly, it's interesting to see which industries have enough cash to sit around on, to some extent. You're like, wow, I wouldn't have thought I thought you'd be a little more urgent about this, but it is amazing how much wealth has been accumulated by some industries, right? And so they can probably ride this thing out, which is unheard of. And I think that to me is what's so interesting, is things that corporations aren't doing. They have all the means in the world to do, but like my son's preschool is like a shining example of a case study of innovation, of pivoting, right? No one ever is going to care about that in the corporate world, but like they're doing every single thing we would tell the client to do, right? Because they have to. And that to me is so interesting. I think, small businesses should come out of this as heroes and role models at a time where they're usually just like not really in the news, right? And that to me, I hope provides it, that's a huge sector of the economy. We typically talk about startups and corporations. I think this is their time to shine. So them giving examples of what corporations should be doing is pretty amazing. They care about their people immensely. Like that's the root of it, and they'll do whatever it takes. And that's just been really fun to see.
It goes back to your point, Natalie, about values, right?
Exactly. And they're way more connected. I mean, they're, you know, they have the advantage of being able to be way more connected to their customers daily and their employees.
Great. So you mentioned the small business. What advice would you have for someone that may be looking at this opportunity as starting a business during this time?
So maybe I can jump in. I would say that I've always been taught some of the best firms emerge during times of crisis, right? So, you know, my personal belief is that you have to understand and separate what's cyclical versus what's structural in terms of the trends. And once you've identified some of those things, you know, let's be honest, go for where your passion's at, right? And you'll find a way to make money. It really does come down to really, let's be honest, doing your homework, understanding exactly what the trends are happening and how you can actually look and take a macro view and frankly a long-term view, and then measure. Sorry, the consultant side of my brain always talks about that, having very clear KPIs and understanding the outcomes.
Natalie, Dave, anything to add?
I completely agree with Scott. I mean, it's there's a lot of needs that are not being met right now that we could take advantage of.
Great.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say is like, you know, there's just gaps that we see as consumers in our everyday. And to your point, Natalie, I just see that, you know, if someone sees a white space or a gap, like go after it and do your homework, like Scott's saying. And there you go.
For example, if anybody wants to start a school for 3 days a week, I'll pay money for it. So
There's a need.
I'll be an early investor. You're up for it.
So one last question here. You know, when you talk about the school, there is what have you seen some of the challenges facing with nonprofits? Is there any examples that you guys can provide there?
I would assume fundraising, right? Everyone is having a tough time with finances, so fundraising probably is the biggest area that's hit.
Right.
I don't work with a lot of nonprofits, so I can't speak to it, but to the detail of that.
I think it's, you know, again, nonprofits like many other organizations. I mean, how close you are to the crisis, I think, to some extent drives the ability to fundraise as well as the ability to stay relevant. So we're doing some work with some organizations that are kind of tangential to the Centers for Disease Control here in Atlanta. And they're going gangbusters because all of a sudden now global health and anything related to support for global health, everything from getting PPE, you know, personal protective equipment, all the way up to finding a vaccine. Clearly a lot of money is being generated. A lot of both corporate as well as private donations are being thrown at that problem. By the same token, you know, I think there are a lot of nonprofits that are probably feeling a lot of pain right now, not because they're not doing good work with their mission, but because they're not part of the big dialogue. You know, so I think about you know, organizations like Habitat and people like that are, you would think, you know, would be going gangbusters in a time of helping people build homes, but I think they're hurting a little bit because it's harder to garner enough attention, you know, from the general population for their mission, for their cause. Not to say it's not a great mission, it's just that it's being subsumed by bigger problems.
Great. Well, we're just after 3 o'clock. I want to move from the formal portion. And first, I just, again, want to thank you for taking the time, for being here, for sharing insight from not just what you're experiencing within your businesses, but also what you were seeing with clients that you work with. So I think if everyone was on, then we would give you a big hand clap there from everyone of a thank you.